Well, good morning, everybody. Salveo Scholastici. What remarkable graduates we have to greet me in Latin, spontaneously. We've already seen evidence of the enormous talent we have in the class of 2011. Enormous talent, perseverance in the face of the adversity of a flag waving in your face, the ability to laugh at those wrinkles that life throws you from time to time. Congratulations, all of you. I can't believe my misfortune that I'm the one who has to follow Dorothy Cotton to the microphone. We want to welcome you, Dorothy, to another beloved community other than Dr. King's beloved community of the movement, and that's the beloved community of Ithaca College alumni. Again, welcome. It's my honor at this point to introduce our commencement speaker. If you think about some of the most important and talked about news stories since just the beginning of 2011, you most likely have seen David Muir right in the middle of the action. In January, he traveled to Tucson, Arizona to report on the aftermath of the shooting of 19 people, including Congresswoman Gabby Giffords. In February, he reported from Tahrir Square in Cairo amidst thousands of protesters demanding the ouster of Egypt's president, Hosni Mubarak. In March, he went to Japan, where he met families displaced first by the earthquake and tsunami, and then by the unfolding crisis at the Fukushima nuclear power plant. Then, in just 3 days, spanning the end of April and the beginning of May, he went from helping anchor Good Morning America's coverage of the royal wedding in London to speaking with families of 9/11 victims at Ground Zero in New York City following the death of Osama bin Laden. In a relatively short time, David Muir has risen to the highest levels of his profession. After graduating from our Roy H. Park School of Communication, I had a feeling you'd make yourself heard. In 1995, David began his professional career at WTVH-TV in his hometown of Syracuse. He continued to distinguish himself as an anchor and correspondent at WCVB-TV in Boston. In 2003, David joined ABC News and quickly became one of the network's lead correspondents on several major domestic and international stories. In 2007, he began anchoring the network's Saturday evening newscast, and shortly after his return from Cairo this February, he was promoted to the anchor of both weekend newscasts, now titled World News with David Muir. He is also a frequent substitute anchor on World News with Diane Sawyer and Good Morning America. His honors include Emmy Awards, the National Headliner Award, and the Edward R. Murrow Award for Investigative Reporting. But David has not forgotten where he got his start. He's returned to IC to speak in the Park School, where he also supports an award to help a journalism major study overseas each year. Last night, just before the Commencement Eve concert, David told me that you only have a few true homes in your life, and Ithaca College is one of them for him. In addition to the stories I've already mentioned, David spent some time this spring traveling around the country for a special ABC News series called Made in America. Given that his first on-camera job came when he was a freshman, that he won a coveted slot anchoring the news for ICTV, I think we can safely and proudly say this is one network news anchor who was made in Ithaca. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to David Muir.
Thank you, President Rochon, members of the Board of Trustees, President Williams, great to have you back. The faculty and staff sitting over here, all of the parents and grandparents who are up there in the stands, and to this beautiful graduating class. Thank you for having me back. It's an extraordinary honor for me to be back at my alma mater here, Ithaca College, and as I drove up here from New York City yesterday, I not only was thinking, they got me out of work tonight, but I was driving up through these beautiful rolling hills of the Finger Lakes, and as the president just told you, I felt as though I'd come home. One of the things that you'll realize very early on, it won't take you long, is that there are just a few places that you can consider home as you make this journey beyond Ithaca. And so when Ms. Cotton says, where do we go from here, always know that you can come back. I graduated in 1995, so not too long ago, and I was thinking about it as I pulled onto campus, and we were driving around. I was being given a quick tour of this sort of explosion of growth here, and I was looking at your brand new athletic center, and in the shadow of this beautiful building was my little beloved Rowland Hall. And I remember what it was like my freshman year in Rowland Hall, my first taste of, well, breaking news. We had celebrated the centennial for Ithaca College, and it was in the cold winter months here in Ithaca. And we'd gotten back to Rowland Hall, and there might have been a few beverages involved, although I wouldn't know. And I was thinking to myself, I'm a little hungry, so why don't I head down the hall, throw some popcorn in the microwave, and get back to the little party going on. And it seemed like just a short time after that, the fire alarms went off. And you could hear the fire engines roaring up the campus. And everybody in their ball gowns and their suits, they start to rush out of Rowland Hall, and I thought, I'd better check on that popcorn. So they're all going one direction, I go the other direction, and sure enough, there was smoke billowing from the kitchen. No fire, but smoke. And I was making my way out thinking I should evacuate too, and I was the last one outside the building, and I learned very quickly what not to do. The fire department had arrived, so did the authorities, and I swung the doors open and I said, I'm alive! And then I wondered why the RA knew I was guilty. I wrote an essay on microwave safety. So I know well what it's like to be here at Ithaca, and I also know what it's like to be here second semester senior year. And in particular, this last week between finals and graduation, anyone remember what you did? So as the news guy, I thought I would bring you up to date on a few things that have happened in the world. As you heard, bin Laden is dead, and it wasn't a cave. He was hanging out in some mansion. Oprah has 3 shows left. But on a much lighter note, the world didn't end yesterday. I was thinking about this on my drive too. I thought, can you imagine surviving 4 Ithaca winters and the world ending the day before you get your diploma? Anyway, if I had to be anywhere covering the end of the world, I wanted to be right here with all of you. When I arrived here my freshman year, as the president mentioned, I applied for that job at ICTV. I was convinced I'm going to be Peter Jennings from the start, with braces. I showed up with the only tie that I had, and I conducted the audition. I did my best, but I was looking around me, and I saw the seniors in the Park School, and some of these young women looked like Diane Sawyer already, and I thought, there is not a chance. But I thought, I'll try for anything that I can sort of get my hands on. So I gave it my best shot. I returned a few days later, and I could see there was a little crowd gathered in the hallway, and they were around the results, and I could hear someone saying, who is this David Muir? And I sort of muscled my way in and looked, and I had been given the job as anchor. As a freshman with those braces. And they showed it last night on the network news. There's no question for me, though, that that moment was a turning point for me in this journey to be this sort of globe-trotting journalist that I had always hoped I would be. I joined ABC, it was 8 years ago now, and one of my first lessons came very early, and I hope it's a lesson you'll take with you here today. Because I know many of you are still looking for jobs. I saw someone with a cap that said hired. I also saw the tassel is worth the hassle. I sort of love that. But one lesson that I hope you'll take with you is that you'll be working likely in the middle of the night, the middle of nowhere, making the middle of nothing. And you'll be wondering, is anyone noticing? And when I joined ABC 8 years ago, I was working in the middle of the night. It was an overnight show called World News Now, and I would show up at 10 o'clock at night, and I would work all night long until about 8 or 9 in the morning. And Peter Jennings was the anchor of the evening news. Many of you grew up, I'm sure, with Peter Jennings on the evening news at night. And when he was off the air at the end of the broadcast every night, he would tape what's called a protective page, where he would toss to a reporter in the building, just in case there was breaking news after he left. We would give him time to get back in the building, and someone would be on TV to cover the news. And on that day, it was my first day as sort of the standby anchor in the building. And I get a phone call, and they say, you have to come down to the edit rooms. And it involves Peter. And I remember thinking, what have I done? I get down there, and they roll the tape. And there it is. It's Peter Jennings finishing his broadcast, saying, thank you, have a good evening, good night, as he always did. And then he's looking down at his scripts, and they say, we have to tape that page. And he says, okay, well, who is it tonight? And the floor director says, it's David Muir. And he goes, David who? She said, David Muir. And he said, oh yeah, he's the chap on the overnight. He's quite good. That plays on loop in my office if any of you would like to come watch it. Another lesson for me as a young journalist at ABC came very early. One of the first assignments I was sent to was to cover Hurricane Katrina. And I was sent down on the eve of the storm, and I remember filing into the Superdome, and yeah, Roland Hall, I'll never get it out of my head. So I was heading into the Superdome, and the storm had not hit yet, and one of the things, the images that I will never get out of my mind, the evacuees they were all carrying their prized belongings in garbage bags because they had hoped to ride out the storm in the dome. And we all sort of filed our way in, and we were there overnight and early in the morning as the storm hit, and I was on my cell phone reporting in live on the air, and the roof was peeling off the top of the Superdome, and it was cascading the water down on the people and their belongings, and I would just hold the phone up to the metal stands, and you could hear the water hitting the stands. And as you all know, that was miserable, but that was just the beginning, because the levees would then break, and the water would pour in through the entire city. Thousands of evacuees then, of course, left the Superdome and headed to the convention center, which, by the way, was where they were told to go. And they waited for help for days. And I remember driving by in our little rental car. It was nothing special. And as we drove by, I was in the back seat, and we had our camera out the window, and they were screaming directly into the camera, "We need help." And I just wanted to slide down in the back seat, so uncomfortable with the relative comfort of our little rental car compared to what we were witnessing. So I got out of the car, we walked through the convention center. There was no food, no medicine, no help. And I began to interview this woman who was a diabetic. She needed insulin, and as she started to tell me this, she went into diabetic shock and collapsed in front of the camera. And I remember thinking, where is the federal response? The next day, the buses pulled in, and the White House had mobilized its effort. And at that moment, I learned a lesson about giving the voiceless a voice. And my message to you today is that you don't have to be a reporter to do this. You'll see opportunities the moment you leave this campus. After the earthquake in Haiti, we were there, and I remember we had hired this fixer, is what we call them. They are the local people who sort of ride around with you and help you make your way as you're covering this story. And for us, it was a young man named Jeffrey. And after about 24 hours of racing to meet deadlines, we finally had the opportunity to ask this young, quiet man in the back seat what had happened to him. And he told me he was the only one left in Haiti. His family had moved to the United States. He was the last one. They thought because he was the oldest, he would get a visa at some point. And he had lost everything. He got out of his apartment building moments before it collapsed, and all that he had was the t-shirt on his back and the jeans he was wearing. So my producer and I, we were siphoning the Hanes t-shirts and whatever other supplies we could find that we had traveled with and put them in a bag, and unbeknownst to one another, we presented him with these materials, and he had a simple question for me. He said, well, I already found a towel. Could you just show me where there might be a shower? And so I gave him the key to this room, and the hotel was sort of decrepit because it had begun to collapse itself. But I said, go use the shower and meet me back, where we were writing the scripts on our laptops outside. And a good hour went by. I had sort of forgotten about him for the moment. I was writing my piece, and I went back to the room. I was bunking with Dr. Besser, our medical reporter, and I heard the shower going, and I thought, oh, it's Dr. Besser. And I turned the corner, and Dr. Besser was in bed. And I looked at him, and he looked at me, and I realized Jeffrey was still in the shower. And so I knocked on the door, and he said, I'm all right, I'll be right out. And he came out and he told me, that's the nicest gift anyone could give me, a shower. And I was convinced that he was spending all of that time in the shower not only to wash off the dirt, but the horror of what he had witnessed that had been playing over and over in his mind. And I thought, I'm going to give this young man a reporter's notebook, more of those t-shirts. We took him with us for the hunt for food and medicine in Haiti, and we showed up at this one warehouse where UN peacekeepers were sitting. They told me they had to take a break for lunch. And sitting in the corner of the warehouse was all of this food that donations had poured in from all over the world. And it wasn't until we got there and asked them, why isn't this being delivered? Why aren't you helping the people? That they then mobilized into action. And Jeffrey looked at me and he smiled and he said, I like what we're doing here. His smile returned, and so did his voice. And just one more lesson that I learned about helping people get their voices came in Egypt just a few months ago. The revolution taking hold, young people, just a year or two older than you, some of them your age, in Tahrir Square in Egypt. And I remember the phone going off, producers telling us you've got to get out of the square, because at that moment, I don't know if you remember, but the Mubarak thugs, as they were called, were coming up the river, many of them on horseback. And we couldn't see because we were in the middle of this square, and sure enough, suddenly they were there. They were racing in, whipping people in the crowd, and right next to me, I remember a man picking up a giant piece of concrete and then smashing it down on the ground to break it into pieces to serve as weapons to fight off these thugs. They were on a mission to take down this revolution for freedom, and they were surrounding journalists too. We knew it was time to leave the square. We found an alleyway, and we were able to get out before we got into trouble ourselves, but we got word very quickly that one of our other teams, a photographer and a producer, had been surrounded and carjacked. They were pulled out of the car. Somebody else got in the driver's seat, and then they were forced back in and down an alleyway in the back streets of Cairo. We couldn't get a hold of them. The cell phones weren't working. We got through, I think, once before the phone was hung up, and we couldn't get through again. And we didn't know what was happening to them. Akram, the veteran war photographer who was in that car, said they took all of them down an alleyway. They pulled them out of the car, and the crowd gathered around the car, multiplying by numbers. And the anger was multiplying too, and they were yelling at the producer and photographer saying, you Americans and Western journalists are the reason why our country is in revolt right now. And they were motioning like this, we will slit your throats. And Akram, the veteran war photographer, said he thought at this moment, this was it. So he looked around the crowd and he spotted an elder, and he reached out to him, and in Arabic, because he knows a little bit of Arabic, said, this is not the Egypt you want to show the world. please, please let us show the world what Egypt is really like. And then he embraced him, physically hugged this man. After a few moments, the man said, I just want you to leave. They got into the car, backed out of that alley, all because of Akram followed his instincts, his heart, and his voice. And I share with you one last lesson from Tahrir Square. Because when those Mubarak men were first making their way into the square, I was interviewing a young woman, just 24 years old. Her name was Gigi Ibrahim. And I wondered why, at first, these men in plain clothes surrounded her and began asking her, why are you doing this? Why are you using your voice like this? She had used Twitter and Facebook to help add to that revolution taking place in that square. She had become one of the faces of freedom in Egypt at 24 years old. Days later, President Mubarak was forced out, and I thought, the power of one young woman's voice. So here's what I say to you all today. You have worked extraordinarily hard these last 4 years, and I say, now it's your turn. You don't need a camera or a microphone to have a voice. I know you already have one. I'm simply here to urge you to use it. We're incredibly lucky to be in a part of the world where we're allowed to use our voices, even if we don't agree with one another, even if there are cable networks that you argue or turn the volume down or turn the volume up. We are lucky. And like that young woman in the square, you have the power to make your own decisions about the world, to shape the world, and to change your world. So you did get me out of work last night, but after graduation today, I have to head back down to New York City to do the news tonight, and I thought we should just, well, the producer asked me, bring back some of your speech, and I thought, why would I bring back more of my voice? Why don't I bring back yours? So give it your best shot. I hope that was just the beginning, and as you prepare to leave this beautiful college on the hill with your family today, that you'll remember to find your voice, to use it. You have all earned it. Thank you so much for welcoming me home.